You think it's easy for me to tell you that? Then back off. Sorry for the outburst, but I'm still trying to deal with the resentment and anger that doesn't go away even after all this time. My life was great until I found out my wife was gifted. I don't think I could have lived with the fact that she is gifted, but I still can't get over the fact that Shauna was so proud and excited about being gifted. She saw it as a blessing and didn't see it as the curse it really was. Shauna McKee and I first met many years ago when we worked for a national telecommunications company in Inverness. She was a dispatcher, and I was a telephone engineer. I fell in love with her soft Highland accent before I even saw her. Of course, it helped that she turned out to be a red-haired beauty with a cheeky smile, a twinkle in her eye, and a scattering of cute freckles. She said she'd first taken a fancy to me because my name was Rob Roy McGregor, like the famous Scottish outlaw of the late 17th century. Perhaps she liked the challenge of taming an outlaw. My job took me all over the Scottish Highlands, and I was responsible for installing and maintaining masts and receivers for faster broadband. It wasn't so much what I did that motivated me, it was where I did it that I enjoyed about my job. The Scottish Highlands became my workplace, where stunning scenery combines with clean air and soft light that makes the heart sing. After the birth of our son Robbie, it didn't take long for Shona to convince me to move back to her home village of Lochmagandy. In retrospect, I shouldn't have agreed to the move. It wasn't because of the location at all. It's a wonderful setting, and Shona's mother and sister lived nearby, so we were never short of babysitting little Robbie for a day, evening, or weekend. Unfortunately, what I didn't anticipate was that Shona would find herself fully involved in the workings of a very close-knit matriarchal community where the women make the important decisions, and the men seem to spend most of their free time in the village pub, drinking whiskey and beer and chatting about the weather or the price of sheep. When the sun shines, you'd think it was a heavenly place. White-walled cottages are scattered on the lower hillsides, and the village of Lochmagandy is a cluster of modest houses, stores, and small cottages around the village square where the road ends at the head of the loch. The village and surrounding farms are sheltered on three sides by what is known as Hoke Magandy, a necklace of high hills around three sides of Glen Magandy, providing protection from extreme weather. It's a beautiful place, but when the clouds overcast the sky and you can't see the hilltops, it becomes bleak and dreary. On such gloomy days, it is easy to believe the story that the loch is haunted by the restless spirit of Morag MacDarrell, a young woman who was drowned one summer evening long ago in 1744. The details of what actually happened will never be known for certain, but the story has been passed down through the generations, and it is Morag MacDarrell's legacy that must be the cause of my sadness. By all accounts, Morag was a vibrant young woman and a great beauty. She lived in an era when life was very harsh and cruel. No one knows exactly how old she was when she met her fate, certainly over 18. But the story goes that it was all about her flirting with the local young men. She naively believed that light flirting would help her find a husband. On that fateful summer evening, 4 young men ambushed her as she was returning from the fields to her parents' home. Perhaps they thought she would offer no resistance, but she must have fought like a wildcat to save her honor. The 4 suspects were later identified by scratches on their hands and faces. Poor Morag had taken one hell of a beating. She was found later that night when a search party led by her father spotted her floating face down in shallow water near the bank of the Laird. At first it was assumed that she had drowned while swimming in the ravine on her way home, but the truth soon became clear. They claimed they had no idea how she drowned. The loss of 4 young men from the available labor force in the small Highland village would have created serious problems for the community. Donald MacDarrell, the clan chief, didn't want that to happen. Acting as judge and jury, he decided the case in favor of the young men, ruling that the assault charges had no merit. After Morag's death, none of the young men were punished. Instead, the lads could continue to work the land as usual, and the local women were left to grumble among themselves about old Donald's failure to punish those responsible. During the following winter, there was much talk in the community about what the consequences of such a gross miscarriage of justice might be. Highlanders are very sensitive to their surroundings and are often very superstitious. Most locals were of the opinion that Morag's spirit could not rest in peace, that the loch was now haunted, and that those responsible would be cursed by fate. Donald MacDerrill, a chief who had failed in his duty to administer justice, soon met a grim end. In 1745, he and his MacDerrill kin, including Morag's murderers, joined Bonnie Prince Charlie's army. At the Battle of Culloden on April 16, 1746, they were among the Highlanders attacking the troops of Prince William, Duke of Cumberland. Donald and the young men who killed Morag were killed. The women of the glen were heartbroken. In addition to losing most of the men, there was the possibility that their fragile economy would collapse, and they would either starve to death or be forced to leave the glen, begging and prostituting in the lowland towns to survive. That they overcame all odds and saved their community is a testament to their strong will and determination to survive, on the one hand. On the other hand, it shows their willingness to go to desperate measures. In the absence of the adult men, old MacDerrill's widow took the lead of the clan. She and several women went to Inverness and successfully petitioned for a meeting with Butcher Cumberland and General George Wade. No one knows exactly what happened at this meeting, but the future of Glen Magandie was secured soon after when General Wade made the glen a staging post and supply depot for the British Army. There was only one road in and out of the glen, making it easily defensible, so that would have been a good enough reason for Wade's decision. However, it appears that the women living in the glen had also given their word to General Wade that soldiers temporarily housed in their home would be very welcome. Indeed, so much so that in the late 18th century, the name of the towering mountain range of Hoch Magandie became synonymous with good entertainment. Many Highlanders saw the actions of the women of Glen Magandie as shameful, but others saw it as a positive and practical strategy with no real alternative. Soldiers came and went, and the seeds of community rebuilding were sown, and literally. Unlike other areas of the Highlands that had been dehumanized, Glen Magandie thrived. The women enjoyed the tranquility of the valley and earned enough to support themselves and their families, producing fine hand-woven woolen clothing that quickly became sought after in Edinburgh and London. The new generation of children, including many bastards with mixed Redskin and MacDerrill blood, grew up in a matriarchal society where the chief was passed from eldest daughter to eldest daughter. Mindful of the fate of Morag MacDerrill, the women of the glen also took steps that they felt would eliminate the risk of similar aggression in the future. We had been living in Loch Magandie for about 5 years and were approaching our 7th wedding anniversary when my life took a turn for the worse. I was as happy as a hog on the moor as spring gradually turned to summer. Shauna was like a bitch in heat every time I came home after a few days on the road. That Friday was pretty typical. Little Robbie was at a sleepover at Aunt Maggie and Uncle Duncan's house, visiting his cousin, another copper-haired 6-year-old boy named Malcolm. We nicknamed the two of them Ginger Nuts. Returning home after a week of maintenance checks up north, I stopped by to say hello to Robbie and thank Maggie and Duncan for giving Shauna and me the night off. Robbie gave me a quick hug, but I played second fiddle. He was more interested in running around with Malcolm. I remember thinking that they would probably be best friends forever. When I got home, the delicious aroma of beef stew with wild mountain thyme wafted from the kitchen. Shauna was bustling around setting the dining room table. She had added a couple of tall candles, usually a sign that she wanted romance, and there was an open bottle of Côte de Rhône on the table. She brought me a cold beer while I hung up my coat and put the dirty laundry in the laundry basket. After a week of working away from home, it always takes me about half an hour to relax and get in the mood for home. Shauna was used to this by now, and didn't expect me to have any meaningful conversation right away. Instead, she filled the gap by telling me about her day or week and the latest gossip. I relaxed with a beer while she fiddled around in the kitchen, stirring stew and putting plates in the top oven to warm up, and chatted about the holiday coming up the next evening. The party was to celebrate the 18th birthday of Callum MacDerrill, whose mother was a lady chief. There would be a first-class band of fiddlers playing and Scottish country dancing. Everyone was going to come from all over the county, and the village hall would be filled with people of all ages, from toddlers to decrepit pensioners. Shauna had made friends with Fiona, the woman chief, and was helping Fiona and Dougal, her husband, to organize the festivities. In recent weeks, Shauna seemed to visit them every time I called her while away from home. She was immensely excited about the preparations for Callum's birthday party and told me more than once how honored she was to have been chosen to help. At dinner, she talked about how wonderful the day was going to be and how great it was that Callum had grown up so quickly and would be 18 tomorrow. She gave him a gold ring engraved with the intertwined initials CS, which she showed me that night after dinner as we sat in the living room enjoying a whiskey from nearby Glenfarclas. "So why isn't it CM for Callum McDarrell?" I asked. "Ask me?" "Oh, that's right." "Well, yes, Stuart is his middle name," she quickly replied, slamming the little red velvet box shut and placing it on the coffee table. I didn't pay it much mind at that moment because she looked at me with one of her special looks. Her twinkling eyes and mischievous grin told me she was ready to go to bed. Cottages in Highland are usually one story, and ours was no exception, so there was no need to climb the stairs, and soon we were lying between the sheets on our big double bed. When Robbie left for the night, I thought we'd have time on Saturday morning, but Shauna was up bright and early, leaving me to doze off while she showered and dressed. "Good morning, lazy bones," she said. "I'm just going to stop by Fiona's, but I'll stop by the bakery on the way back and get us some breakfast rolls. You can stay in bed for once, and after breakfast we'll go get Robbie." I thought about lying in bed after she left, but decided to get up and do some housework. Taking a quick shower, I changed into jeans and my favorite green and black plaid shirt, loaded the washer, and went to tidy up the living room before getting on with the rest of the chores. On the coffee table still lay the small red box with the ring on it. Next to it lay an envelope addressed to Callum McDarrell, no doubt containing a birthday card. Apparently, Shauna had forgotten to bring them with her. I suppose we could have given them to Callum in the evening, but I found it easier to take them straight away myself. The chief's cottage stood alone, in the middle of the land that legally belonged to the chief and was comparatively secluded. But it was less than a mile away if you cut across the fields, and I thought the fresh air would blow away the cobwebs left by the balvenie. And I could see the lakeside village in the distance as I walked through fields of long, lush meadow grass that the sheep love so much. I had to climb over a couple of dry stone walls, but it wasn't until about 20 minutes later that I reached the stone barn adjoining the cottage. To get to the front door of the cottage, I had to go around the back of the barn and down the north side of the cottage. Chief's cottage is an old Highland cottage, long and low, with thick whitewashed walls and a black slate roof that was originally thatched. When it was built over 200 years ago, it was important to minimize heat loss, so the windows are quite small, especially on the north and west sides of the cottage facing the prevailing wind and weather. However, as I was making my way along the north side of the cottage, the window I passed by was large enough for me to see my wife, and that stopped me in my tracks. It was obviously the bedroom, and she was lying on a big double bed with some asshole. I don't know how long I stood there like I was mesmerized. It felt like the earth froze. At first I didn't realize who it was, but then I saw it was Callum McDarrell. What the hell? I jerked away from the window and leaned my back against the outside wall of the cottage, almost gasping. I realized I must have stopped breathing normally while the horrific sight unfolded before me. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, and now I felt physically sick. My mind was screaming in protest at the information I had just received, and my body was straining to clear itself. I put my head between my legs and inhaled deeply, trying to regain control of myself. I don't know how long I stood like that. Maybe a couple minutes. I was stunned, but as a maintenance engineer, I was trained to deal with difficult problems. Abrupt reactions aren't my style. I had no idea why Shauna would have fun with Callum, but if I struck right away, others might get hurt. My main concern was little Robbie, and I needed to find out more about what was going on before taking any drastic action. I headed home, keeping the barn and a small grove of pine trees between the chief's house and myself, so I wouldn't be seen, though it was unlikely. My thoughts were jumbled and confused. It seemed obvious that Shauna had planned the whole thing. She was unlucky that I had decided to pass up the opportunity to snuggle in bed and instead deliver the card and gift she had forgotten. I was shocked, confused, and angry. I realized I couldn't deal with Shauna right away, and I needed to get my act together. Back at our house, I put the card and gift for Callum back on the coffee table. In the kitchen, I left a note for Shauna to let her know that I had decided to take advantage of the dry weather and went for a walk around Homagandi. She knew that I like to do this fairly regularly, and that it is standard to take my lunch with me to walk 12 miles in 6 hours around the horseshoe-shaped circle of the 3 highest peaks. For the next few hours, I gave my all to walking the hills, and the magnificent views from these peaks allowed me to calm down a little and begin to recover from the shock of my wife's infidelity. Returning home in the late afternoon, I still wasn't sure what I was going to do. There was no point in crying over spilled milk, but the nature of my relationship with my wife would have to be reevaluated, and I might have to make some tough decisions. One thing I was sure of: I wasn't going to upset the apple carts by having a showdown before the holiday party, because gossip in mountain communities spreads like wildfire. Everyone does their own thing, comparing notes and spreading conjecture, rumors, and lies. In no way did I want the entire nation to meddle in our personal lives. A holiday is a high-risk disclosure event, and the gossipers could feast on random scraps of information, such as a missing husband, an upset wife, or a battered birthday boy. The walk in the hills cleared my thoughts, but I still had a hard time making eye contact with Shauna when I returned after lunch. Fortunately, Robbie proved to be a useful distraction. He sat next to me on the couch and talked about what he'd been doing with his cousin. The highlight was meeting the snails his cousin Malcolm had found in the garden. For a 6-year-old, Robbie was quite knowledgeable about the natural world, and we had an interesting discussion about the difference between snails and slugs. Robbie decided that snails were clever in that they had grown a hard shell so they didn't hurt themselves. Shauna cooked Aberdeen Angus burgers, and we sat down to eat around 6 o'clock, which is as late as Robbie can tolerate. The conversation was about the feast, which would start fairly early to accommodate the younger participants. Robbie and I would put on our red McGregor kilts, and all 3 of us would be there when it started around 7 in the evening. Robbie knew there would be a clown showing tricks to entertain the kids at the start of the evening while the adults had drinks and chatted. We didn't talk about how long we would stay because it depended on Robbie's well-being. Scottish village dances are a wonderful invention, whereby everyone has a chance to dance and socialize with all sorts of people. Other countries around the world have similar or comparable social dance formats, such as circle dancing, barn dancing, or line dancing. In a small place like Lomagandi, almost everyone dances with everyone else, and this evening was no exception. Kylid started with the children trying out the simpler dances, mostly with the help of their parents and grandparents. Robbie's favorite dance was the Dashing White Sergeant, which he learned at school. Together, we formed a family trio, dancing energetically around the hall, forming a 6 on each lap, with the next trio coming our way. Dancing with Robbie, we must have looked like we were doing okay, but I was having a hard time keeping up the facade of a happy family. Despite what she was doing this morning, Shauna showed no signs of worry or anxiety. She was beaming with a smile and accepting compliments about our talented son and how well the 3 of us dance. I kept checking to see if she would find an excuse to go and talk to Callum McDarrell, but other than wishing him a happy birthday and handing him a card and present when we first arrived, she studiously ignored him. Neither I nor anyone else could suspect anything was going on between them, and I began to wonder if this was just a one-time infatuation. As expected, Robbie began to tire as the evening went on. Shauna spent most of the time looking after him while he played with his little friends, including Malcolm. I thought she expected me to take Robbie home so she could have a chance to flirt and dance with Callum, but was surprised to learn that she had arranged for Robbie and Callum to spend the night at our place. Shauna and Maggie drove the 2 boys back to our place around 9:30. Maggie came back to the cafe about half an hour later. She told me that Shauna and her would take turns, and each would sit with the boys for an hour while the other had fun at the party. This meant that Shauna would be back in about an hour when Maggie relieved her of her babysitting duties. I danced with Maggie and some of the other women and tried my best to act normal, whatever that was. The music got in the way of conversation, but that was fine with me, and I ended up standing on the edge of the crowd, sipping a beer and listening to a group of fiddlers playing various rills, strathspies, and jigs. While I was generally looking in the direction of the band, I was also watching for any sign that someone knew my wife was being entertained behind my back. Really, I couldn't be sure of that. A couple times it occurred to me that some women might know something. One or two looked in my direction, but I figured they were just checking me out. Callum McDarrell had done his share of dancing. His grandmothers, aunts, and his mother's friends took turns on the dance floor with the birthday boy. The men took turns buying him a beer when the women gave him a timeout. No doubt he was well-mannered and popular, and under other circumstances, I wouldn't have failed to buy him a drink. But there was no such opportunity now. While waiting to order a beer at the bar, I happened to be sitting next to Callum's father, Dougal. I didn't know if he knew about Callum and Sean, but here was an opportunity to reveal a small part of the mystery. "You must be a proud father, Dougal," I said, smiling at him. "Yes, I suppose I am," he replied. "Tell me, is Callum named after your grandfather, or anyone else in the family?" I asked. "Yes, Callum is his maternal grandfather." "Then his middle name would be Dougal, after you?" "No, it's Hector, after his paternal grandfather," said Dougal. "How interesting," I replied. "Are these kind gentlemen with us today?" "Perhaps in spirit," he replied. "They both live far from here. Grandpa Callum emigrated to Canada many years ago, and Grandpa Hector lives with my sister and her family in Australia. It's a shame they lack a good sealet, but it can't be helped," I said, ending our brief conversation and paying for my beer. Dougal had unwittingly provided me with evidence that Shona and Callum's morning session had hardly been a spontaneous one, arising in the blink of an eye. Undoubtedly, the C on the gold ring stood for Callum, but it was safe to say that the Esh stood for Shauna. In my opinion, the intertwined letters could very well stand for cuckold whore. My mood was not improved when my wife reappeared a little after 11 o'clock. After looking around the hall, she gave me a brief wave and then headed straight for Callum McDarrell. Was this really the moment they had been waiting for all evening? At first glance, all she did was take her turn to dance with the birthday boy, but it seemed to me that the broad smiles of anticipation on their faces were impossible to mistake. He accepted her invitation without hesitation, and soon they were twirling around the dance floor in each other's arms. If I hadn't been attentive to these signs on other people's faces, I might not have noticed anything, but the onlookers who knew something was going on couldn't help themselves. Watching the dancing couple, many women, including my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, furtively cast glances in my direction. They were no doubt amused at the thought of my wife dancing with her young lover, and me not understanding. I put on a poker face and only decided to leave when Shauna and Callum remained on the dance floor after 2 dances. Someone must have suspected I knew what was going on. As I stood outside in the dark, trying to chase away the thought that half of Lochmagundi seemed to know that I had become a cuckold, Dougal came up behind me. "You don't look happy, Rob. What's the matter?" "Your son and my wife," I replied. "So you've all found out. Fiona thought you might be with them. Please don't make a scene tonight. Fiona would like to be able to talk to you tomorrow morning about what is going on. Tell Shauna you have a bit of a headache, and then come and join us when she takes little Robbie to church. It's really important for you to hear what Fiona has to say. May I tell her you'll be there?" He looked at me anxiously as I considered what to say. "To be honest, I'm not sure it would do much good, Dougal, but I suppose I can wait until then. I'm not going to make a scene, as you put it. Just keep your son away from my wife. I have no idea how many people know about them, but it would be better if they didn't spend the rest of the evening in each other's arms on the dance floor. This is just pouring salt on my wounds, and I'm not sure I have the patience to take it." "Thanks, Rob. I'll get Fiona to talk to Callum quietly." I waited 5 minutes before returning to the club. Shona was now dancing with her brother-in-law Duncan. Callum was dancing with his older sister Heather, a 22-year-old black-haired beauty who was next in line to become chief and was studying accounting and finance at the University of Inverness. When the dance was over, Shauna came over to me and gave me a big hug and kiss. She was still radiating happiness and clearly had no idea that I knew about her affair with Callum. We ended the evening with a dance and then walked hand in hand up the hill to our cottage. I tried to act like everything was normal, and it helped that Shauna kept going on and on about what a success the party had been, who had been there, and how they all said they'd really enjoyed it, and the band had been amazing, and so on. I bit my tongue and just interspersed her conversation with random lines like, yeah, or right. Maggie was happy to see us and agreed that Shauna and I would take both boys to church in the morning, and Malcolm would meet Mom and Dad there. Shauna checked to make sure the boys were okay, then went straight to bed and seemed to fall asleep before I had finished in the bathroom. I lay awake for a while, wondering what the clan leader could say to me to change the course of my thoughts. I was almost certain that my marriage was mortally wounded, and felt that Lady Fiona was unlikely to be able to resuscitate it. The next morning, Shona made breakfast and took the boys to church herself when I told her I had a slight headache and needed some fresh air. As the devout residents of Lochmagondi entered the village kirk that Saturday morning, I repeated the journey to heartbreak I had made 24 hours earlier. Soon, I was outside the chief's cottage. Fiona opened the door when I knocked. "Thanks for coming, Rob," she said, as she let me into the living room. "The others are at church, so we won't be disturbed. I'll boil the kettle and make us each a cup of tea unless you'd prefer whiskey." I didn't care for a cup of tea, but to refuse would have been extremely rude, and I expected our conversation to be difficult as it was, if not off to a bad start. Fiona brought the tea and we settled opposite each other in the two padded armchairs by the fireplace. I didn't know what Fiona wanted to say to me and waited for her to speak. "First of all, I'm sorry to hear about Sean and Callum," she said. There was a note of concern in her voice. "May I ask how it happened? Did someone tell you?" I tried to keep my cool, especially in the presence of little Robbie and Malcolm, but my anger must have been obvious to Fiona. "It doesn't matter how I found out, Fiona," I said. "No one has told me, although it seems that many people know that your son has been entertaining my wife." "Rob, that's not all," she replied. "It's a long story, and I need you to listen to what I'm about to tell you. I'll do my best to answer any questions you have. The only thing I want to ask of you is that you promise to listen to me before you make any decisions. Can you do that?" "All right, Fiona. You can speak up, but I don't think it will make any difference." "Thank you, Rob. I won't deny that Shona and Callum had a close relationship. What you don't know is that Shona was gifted. I don't mean that she was talented or endowed with some gift from God. I'm talking about a woman's gift to a young man when he reaches adulthood." "Wait a minute, Fiona," I interrupted in amazement. "Are you saying that Shona and Callum were having fun because it's some sort of tradition or rite of passage when he turns 18? "Yes, Rob, roughly," she replied. "You see, the tradition of gifting women at Glenmagandy began after Morag MacDarrell. Everyone knows Morag's story, and everyone knows that after 1745, the women of Glenmagandy took over the running of the valley. These women did everything they could to rebuild the community and ensure the Glen prospered. Yes, they welcomed soldiers in red uniforms into their beds, but what most people don't know is that they also made sure that the young women of the Glen were never again at risk of being killed by chauvinistic young men." "Let me get this straight, Fiona. Are you saying that it wasn't enough for the old whores to just have fun with the soldiers? They decided to entertain the local youth as well?" "Rob, you're deliberately misrepresenting what I'm trying to tell you. It wasn't like that at all. The women who were originally gifted were maidens or widows of men who died in the war. For many years, the men of Glenmagandy had sought their fortunes in North America, and it was always possible to join the fight there. They fought against the French, against the Native American Indians, against Santa Anna and its Mexicans. They fought each other in the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War. In between, they joined the gold rush in California, but there were hardly any women with them. The 20th century brought more terrible wars that demanded Glenn's men. The Boer War in South Africa was followed by World War I, the Spanish Civil War, World War II, and the Korean War in the 50s. For over 2 centuries, there was no shortage of unmarried women to bestow. So if it's unmarried women who participate in this tradition, how the hell did Shauna end up being gifted? I asked. All Glen women are expected to honor the tradition and be willing to be gifted. These days we're lucky that our men aren't dying in wars, but that means there are few widows and single women in our community. Instead, the gifted women are those whose husbands are often away from home. These men may be working on oil rigs in the North Sea for weeks at a time, or simply be in Glasgow or Edinburgh Monday to Friday. The important thing is that a gifted woman can be available and yet not interfere with home life. Sounds to me like the whole thing is just an excuse for older women to enjoy illicit trysts with young lads, I told her. That's not true at all, she replied. So you're speaking from experience, Fiona? Have you ever been gifted? I asked. I don't really have to answer that question, but I want to reassure you, Rob. The answer is yes, but that was years ago, and I won't tell you any more than that. A gifted woman and her young man are expected to behave responsibly and keep their relationship as private as possible. Perhaps Shauna and Callum should have shown a little more restraint last night. So you're saying that Shauna stated that she was ready, willing, and able to entertain Callum, but they should have been a little more discreet? Rob, it's not just that. Gifts are given with care and tenderness. Courtship lasts for 3 months until the young man's 18th birthday. During this period, the couple meet as often as possible and get to know each other, spending time together, talking about everything that is important in life and the young person's plans for the future. There is no contact during the courtship period, although at most, the couple may hold hands and kissing is also allowed. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. No wonder my wife had been such a frequent guest at Fiona's cottage over the past few months. She'd been seeing Callum. But it's worse than that, I said. You're telling me it's a full-blown affair. The only salvation would be that it was some spontaneous, unforeseen event, some one-off mistake. Fiona paused, as if contemplating what to say next. I know, Rob. It must be hard for you to understand what's going on, but the relationship between Shauna and Callum isn't really an affair, and it poses no real threat to your marriage. Callum needs to learn how to deal with women and relationships, and Shauna is a wonderful person who has taken it upon herself to help him do that. Of course, we were all hoping you wouldn't find out that Shauna was gifted, but you should realize that gifting women is a long tradition in our society. It is widely supported, and gifted women are held in high esteem. That may be true, I replied, but who caused it? Who is the matchmaker? Who decides which woman is to be gifted? A young man may express a preference for one woman or another, but the final decision rests with the clan chief, she said, looking me straight in the eye. It is always a carefully considered decision, and neither the woman nor the young man is forced into a relationship. Then let me guess, I replied, trying to keep my cool. Callum told you he wanted to entertain my wife. You asked her and she agreed. That's a very crude way of putting it, Rob, she objected. Very crude way of putting it. That's what it was. But I can't think of a better person than Shauna to teach Callum about love, respect, and responsibilities in the adult world. I couldn't agree more, I said. All he's learned is lust, disrespect, and thoughtlessness. Lust for my wife, disrespect for me, and damn the consequences. What about the risk of pregnancy? It seems a high price to pay for a few moments of pleasure. It's up to the gifted couple to decide whether or not to take precautions. Strictly speaking, it is part of the tradition that the woman is gifted unconditionally. Many children in the Glen owe their existence to the gift of their mothers, often in circumstances where the women would not otherwise have been blessed with offspring. For hundreds of years, these children have helped to populate this part of the Highlands. For example, after the First and Second World Wars, giftedness gave some women children they otherwise would not have had because their husbands died in those wars. So, Fiona, besides the occasional unlucky bastard child, there must be other consequences to women gifted by young men? Not really. There's only been one or two minor problems, but overall it's a very positive experience. Sometimes we intervene if it looks like there might be a problem. The last time that happened was when John and Mary MacDonald moved to Glasgow, shortly after you moved here. So that's why they left. She was obviously very upset about leaving, and he couldn't wait to get away. Yes. I'm afraid she got too emotionally involved with the young man she was gifted with. She wanted their relationship to last longer than a year. So you're saying she got more than just a one-time romp in the hay? Perhaps you don't quite understand, Rob. You see, gifts aren't just a one-time reward for good behavior. It's an incentive to stay in the Glen longer. Young men often don't know what they want to do with their lives. The gift is given for 1 year or until the young man leaves the Glen, whichever comes first. I was stunned. Are you seriously telling me that Callum expects to entertain Shauna for the next 12 months? Please try to understand, Rob. Gifting has eliminated unwanted aggression from young men because gifted women help them become mature, confident, and well-mannered. Sure, the physical intimacy is present, but during this time the young man learns about women and relationships, and emotionally, he is better prepared to face the world. That sounds good to you, Fiona, but do you really think I'm just going to stand by and let Callum entertain Sean? A herd of pigs will blow the nest on your roof before I let that happen. Look, Rob, I know you're upset, but try to understand that this is part of Shauna's legacy. As a Glen McGandy woman, she has no choice, and it won't be for long. By all means, talk to her about it, but I would advise you not to take a hard stance. An ultimatum is rarely a good negotiating strategy. It looked like our conversation had come to an end, so I stood up. I have to go now, Fiona. I've listened to everything you've said and tried to understand, but as far as I can see, not much has changed. If anything, the situation is getting worse, but thanks anyway for the tea and conversation. Fiona walked me to the front door. Don't do anything rash, Rob, and remember you can always come and talk to me. I wondered if Fiona would alert Shauna that I was aware of what was happening. I would have preferred the benefit of complete surprise, but only because I wanted to get an unprepared and unvarnished reaction from Shauna. When Robbie and Shauna returned from church, I couldn't tell for sure if she knew I was watching her, but she looked a little mangled. Bacon rolls for Sunday lunch in the kitchen were one of Robbie's favorite things to do, and we were constantly making sure his enthusiasm didn't lead to any major spills. Although he was young enough to help himself, he hadn't quite mastered portion control yet, especially with tomato ketchup. After lunch, I set Robbie up in the living room. He enjoyed playing with his collection of toy cars, and then returned to the kitchen to join Shauna. She watched me closely as I sat down at the kitchen table again, so I guess she knew what was in store for me. I wasn't going to beat around the bush. Looking directly at her, I told her, "I know about you and Callum." She sighed. "I know you know," she replied. "Why did you do that, Shauna?" I asked. "Because I'm a Glen McGandy woman, Rob," she replied. "You can take the woman out of the Glen, but you can't take the Glen out of the woman. It is my duty and my destiny to carry on our legacy. We can't just scrap over 2.5 centuries of tradition that has been passed down through generations of women and protected the foundations of our society." "But haven't you thought about what will happen to us?" "Of course I've thought about it. I'm sorry you're upset, but you know I love you, just as I know you love me. You have to realize that what I'm doing doesn't threaten what you and I have." "I don't see how you can say that," I replied. "I have a hard time understanding your reasoning, Shauna. You have committed adultery, and our marriage is in grave danger." "Please don't look at it that way, Rob. I hope we can make things right, and you'll see that our marriage is stronger than ever. I knew you'd find out what's wrong, but I didn't think it would be so soon, so maybe I didn't prepare for this conversation as well as I should have. The thing is, I'm not having an affair with Callum because he's not in love with me, and I'm not in love with him. If you think about it, all I do is reward him for good behavior and teach him life skills. What happens won't affect you and me in any way." "How do you figure that?" I asked. "Nothing will really change. I'll always be with you whenever you come. I can take care of Callum when you're not home, and you won't see him when you come back. You don't see Callum much at all. On weekends, he's usually away with friends, going to a soccer match in Inverness or some music festival. That's not going to change. But you're asking me to share you with Callum. I don't think so, Rob. You'll get all the love and affection I've always given you, but I'm 32 years old and I've got plenty of room to spare. I'm not taking anything away from you to give to Callum. What he gets will just be extra that I can provide. I guess we'll have to agree on that. I know I don't own you, but you are my wife and I am your husband. I'm not going to accept the fact that you might temporarily give up your marriage vows to be faithful and devoted to me. That's a very ungraceful attitude, Rob. I thought you could see beyond the small details and understand the good we're trying to accomplish. It's a great honor for me. I've been chosen to make a man out of this boy. That's something special. Not only that, but he's the son of a chief. You make it sound like it's something between a ceremonial ritual and a transcendent experience, Shauna. But really, it's just an affair with a young guy who decided he wanted to entertain you and have you to himself. You may think so, Rob, but it's a very unusual arrangement. Many other women have gone down this path before me, and their husbands have generally been supportive, realizing it's a small sacrifice in exchange for peace and prosperity in the Glen. What happens if the husband objects? Most husbands realize they only have to turn a blind eye, so they don't object. Very rarely does the husband object, and he ends up leaving the Glen. As you know, when it comes to business, it is the women who control what happens in this valley. That sounds like an ultimatum to me, I said. Your friend Fiona warned me not to give you ultimatums, so I'm puzzled that you might want to go down that path. I'm not forcing you to do anything, Rob. In fact, everyone would be better off if you did nothing, yourself included. This is all very new to you, and you probably need time and space to think things through. I think we both need to think this through carefully, Shauna. I think I know what I need to do, but I'll agree to wait a few days if you agree to stay away from Callum. I didn't wait for her reply and walked into the living room to see if Robbie wanted to go for a walk. It was a casual Sunday afternoon, which meant that Shauna had some time to herself, and Robbie could spend time with me for a change. I couldn't help being away from home during the work week, and I treasured those couple hours each week. Robbie and I would usually end up on the lakeshore looking for wading birds that like to feed in the reedy shallows. Robbie's favorite bird was the gray heron, with its long legs, long beak, and gray, black and white plumage. He was thrilled to see a lone heron that day. It stood motionless, hunched over, leaning its long neck on its chest and hiding its head as if it wanted to hide from the world. For the rest of the day, Shauna and I barely spoke to each other. We both tried to keep the conversation going with Robbie, who eagerly told Shauna about the heron and his plans for the week ahead. I don't think he realized that the atmosphere was tense that evening. As far as I could tell, Shauna was keeping quiet, trying to buy time and avoid escalating the crisis in the hope that I would eventually come to agree with her position. I don't think she realized the extent of my anger and that I was only containing it through determined self-control, which included refusing to discuss it further. There was little I could do if Shauna chose to ignore my plea to cool down towards Callum. As I packed my bag that evening, I couldn't help but think about how I would feel if I had to leave home for good. What I was feeling was already almost unbearable. It was as if the three of us had been in a car accident, and the wife I loved was suddenly taken from me. All I had left to hold on to was my son. How could I avoid losing him? I needed time to realize what was happening and what I could do about it. I got up early the next morning, intending to hit the road before Shauna got up. I was just finishing my coffee and putting on my jacket when she appeared in her robe. Her eyes looked puffy and red. Apparently, she hadn't slept well. "Drive carefully, Rob," she said as I headed for the door. "Please remember that I love you. Let's talk later this week." "Okay, Shauna," I replied. I'll be damned if I let her hear the L word from me. Looking back, I think I spent the first part of that week in a daze and shock. I didn't call home or hear from Shauna, but that wasn't unusual. I was often in remote areas where the phone network was very poor, which was why we were trying to upgrade and improve the telecommunications infrastructure. That Thursday night, like most Thursdays, I was booked into a serviced apartment that the company rented in Inverness. It was much more comfortable than a boring hotel room and had all the necessary home comforts, including a good selection of whiskey. I was just finishing writing up my reports in preparation for the weekly management meeting the next day when the doorbell rang around 7 in the evening. I opened the door, and there stood Lady Fiona. She was wrapped against the evening chill in what I would call country attire: a dark green Barber jacket, tight khaki pants, and sturdy brown leather knee-high boots. The Range Rover SUV, the color of British racing green that complemented her outfit, was undoubtedly parked outside the apartment. "Good evening, Rob. I apologize for dropping by unannounced. May I come in?" she asked. "Sure," I replied, opening the door and letting her into the living room. She took off her jacket, exposing a simple white blouse and beige cardigan, and sat down in a chair. I wasn't really surprised to see her, but I still had to ask. "Did you come all the way to Inverness just to see me, Fiona?" "More or less. I met my daughter this afternoon, but you're the main reason I'm here. I'd like to have a cup of tea if you don't mind, and then perhaps we can talk about everything." I went into the kitchen and put the kettle on. Making tea isn't just about hospitality. It's also a very British way of dealing with trouble. It's customary to greet bad news with a steadfast stamina and a boiling kettle. I had a bad feeling about Fiona's visit, but the process of making tea gave me a chance to reflect on why she came to see me. She was no spring chicken and was dressed very conservatively. I was sure she wasn't going to try and seduce me, but she seemed to have some plans, and I hoped she wasn't bringing bad news. And as I returned to the living room and took a sip of tea, she didn't waste any time with conversational pleasantries. "I'll get straight to the point, Rob. I've been talking to Shauna about the situation we're in, and I think we can resolve it to some extent. That's why I'm here." "I'm not sure it's going to be easy, Fiona, but thanks for coming. It sounds like you bring good news. Does this mean you've canceled Shauna's donation?" "Not exactly, Rob, but we've given a lot of thought to your position and tried to see it from your point of view. Shauna and I agree that we misjudged your reaction, and now we need to see if there's any way we can make amends." "I don't see how that's possible if Shauna continues to have fun with Callum." "I'm not going to deflect from my purpose by challenging your choice of phrasing, Rob, but I would prefer you avoid swearing. I realize your emotions are running high, but I'd appreciate it if you said, 'gave yourself to Callum' rather than using the F word." "Very well, Fiona, but if she continues to give herself to Callum, how does that resolve the situation?" That was exactly the problem we were facing, but then we realized we were only looking at one half of the equation. We thought about what you said and tried to look at it from your point of view. You saw that Shauna gained something and you gained nothing or lost out on something. That's not quite true, Fiona, but I think you're beginning to understand. Thanks, Rob. I hope you like the solution we've come up with. And what would that be, Fiona? Heather. Heather? Yes, Rob. My daughter, Heather. She lives here and can take care of your needs in Inverness, while Shauna takes care of her brother in Glenmagandy. I looked at her in amazement. Are you serious? Absolutely. She thinks you're a great guy and will be happy to help. In fact, I think she really likes the idea. I was stunned. Up until that point, I'd thought there was at least a glimmer of hope that Fiona would tell me they'd decided to cancel Shauna's gift. Instead, she shoved her own daughter at me in an attempt to make things right. Fiona knew she'd caught me off guard and waited to see if I was interested, tilting her head slightly to the side and raising an eyebrow expectantly. At the same moment, the confusion dissipated, and the depression and sadness I'd been feeling for the past few days was replaced by an icy anger. In those brief moments of revelation, I realized that I had lost my wife and my marriage was beyond saving. But I also knew without a doubt that at some point I would settle the score with my betrayers. I wasn't quite sure how I would do it, but I wasn't about to let them know what I was thinking. It's a hell of an offer, Fiona, I told her. If I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that no matter what happens, Shauna will give herself to Callum, but you're offering to balance that equation by offering me Heather. She looked at me and nodded. That's about right, Rob. Okay, Fiona. I don't know what to say right now. I need to think it over, and I'll talk to Shauna this weekend. We'll see what we do next. Good, Rob. I think that's what we were hoping for. Thanks for the tea, she said, rising to her feet. I'll be staying at Heather's apartment tonight. She handed me a small piece of paper. Here's her phone number, she said. I'll tell her you can reach me. Driving back to Glen McGandy on Friday evening, I was still thinking about what to do. In the short term, I needed to verify and confirm that Shauna would continue to have fun with Callum, no matter what I said or did. If my wife wanted to have a relationship with someone else, then I would not have a relationship with her, although the possibility may not have crossed her mind. I also had to decide whether or not to accept Heather McDarrell's offer as some sort of consolation prize. After that, I could decide what to do to keep myself safe in the medium to long term. When I got home, Shauna was worked up. I think she was grateful to Robbie for monopolizing me for an hour or so before heading to bed. Meanwhile, she was trying her best to repeat the wonderful evening we had enjoyed exactly a week ago. She brought me a cold beer while Robbie chatted, and then got busy in the kitchen making ragu bolognese. When Robbie was put to bed, Shauna opened a bottle of Barbera d'Asti, and we sat down to eat. I guessed what we were going to talk about, but left it to Shauna to start the conversation herself. Fiona said she spoke to you last night. What do you think of the solution we came up with? She asked. It's not what I wanted, I replied. Did you go out with Callum while I was away this week? She looked away, avoiding my gaze. I'm sorry, Rob. I've been gifted with him, so I can't just turn him down. So you did decide to do it after all, just like Fiona told me? She looked worried, but determined. Yes, she said quietly, nodding her head in confirmation of her intentions. I know you don't like it, Rob, but it's what I have to do. I decided to give her one last chance to change her mind. I hear what you're saying, but I still don't understand why you feel you have to do this, Shauna. I'm not going to threaten you or give you an ultimatum, because you have to decide for yourself what you want to do. I can't make you stop what you're doing, but are you sure you can live with the consequences, whatever they may be? Yes, Rob. I know it will be hard, but I think I can. It won't be forever, and I won't take offense at you if you decide to balance the equation. I think you're making a big mistake, Shauna, but it sounds like you've already made up your mind. Is there nothing I can say or do to change the situation? No, Rob. I don't think there was any chance of that, she replied. You see, I didn't tell you that I myself am a gifted child. I wouldn't exist if it weren't for the giftedness. My mother was gifted, and I am a result of that. My biological father was a young man to whom she was gifted. The giftedness created me, so it was almost inevitable that the circle of life would lead to me becoming gifted in turn. Wait a minute, Shauna. You told me that your father died in a car accident when your mom was pregnant with you. Now you're telling me he wasn't your real father? Yes, she replied. It's true that my mom's husband, my dad, died when his car fell off a cliff. I don't know exactly what happened, but it turns out he was well insured, so we didn't suffer any financial loss. I guess my mom never got over his death. She told me about my biological father when I was a teenager, so I knew why my medical records were different from what I might have expected to see. That's a hell of a story, Shauna, but I still don't understand why she would have you have an affair with a teenager. Rob, it's my destiny. Being gifted led to my existence, and my existence led to my being gifted. I realized there was nothing more I could say to change her mind, so I just nodded, and for a while we ate in silence, each with our own thoughts. However, I had one more important question to ask. From now on, I don't want Robbie socializing with Callum or his family. Can you promise me that? I asked. Of course, she replied quickly, smiling uncertainly at me. I don't know if she thought I was accepting of our changed circumstances, but it was just damage control on my part. I was going to do everything I could to make sure my son didn't encounter any strange behavior that might affect his young mind. He was already going to have a hard time dealing with the changes in our family relationship. After dinner, I decided to treat myself to an 18-year-old Glenfarclas single malt wine, which I sipped while we sat and watched some mindless television chatter. Eventually, when we went to bed around midnight, it was as if a huge weight had been lifted off me, and I fell asleep almost immediately. I have no idea if Shauna slept as soundly, but I'm pretty sure my subconscious recognized that the deed was done, and change was inevitable. Sunday morning, I told Shauna that I wouldn't be going to church with her and Robbie anymore. There was no way I wanted to play happy family with her and give people the impression that I was okay with being a cuckold. I think she knew the reason I didn't go to church with her, but wasn't completely sure. "Why don't you want to go to church?" she asked. "Have you lost your faith in God?" "No, but I don't think he's here," I replied. "I'm going for a walk in the hills instead. If God exists, he will find me there." In fact, I didn't go for a walk in the hills that Sunday morning. Instead, I used the time when Shauna and Robbie weren't home to move my things into the guest bedroom. Shauna didn't know what I had done until we went to bed in the evening. I made sure to lie down first and was already in bed with the lights off when Shauna poked her head out from behind the guest bedroom door. "What are you doing here, Rob?" she asked. "What does it look like, Shauna?" I replied. "I'm not sharing a bed with you if you're sharing it with Callum McDarrell." "Come on, Rob. Really?" "Damn right, Shona. I'm not going to make a big deal out of it, but you're going to have to get over it or I'll move out. For Robbie's sake, I hope it doesn't come to that." She frowned and her lips pressed together in irritation. "Okay, Rob, if that's the way it's going to be. I think you're being a little silly, cutting off your nose despite your face. You know where to find me if you need me." The next week on the road, I decided I wasn't going to entertain Heather McDarrell as compensation for the temporary loss of her brother's spouse. I wasn't going to go along with the absurd notion that some weird infidelity equation was being solved. Absolutely not. I was going to entertain Heather simply for my own pleasure, provided she wasn't forced to offer herself to me. You see, years ago, I'd learned to make the best of a bad situation. My then-girlfriend didn't like me smoking cigarettes. "It's like kissing an ashtray," she told me. Then she said I would have to choose between her and cigarettes. I understood her point of view, so I decided to give up cigarettes, but it wasn't easy. The first 2 months were the hardest, and I was grumpy like a bear with a sore head. Then she decided she wasn't interested in me anymore, and we broke up. So how did I capitalize on this unpleasant situation? You guessed it. I never smoked another cigarette, and as a consequence, I became slimmer and healthier. Shona's affair with Callum was another bad situation. No matter what I did, it wasn't going to save my marriage. So how could I make the best of this bad situation? Well, for a start, it would be a good idea to entertain Heather McDarrell, so I called her on Wednesday and we agreed to meet for dinner in Inverness on Thursday. I suppose I could have just asked her to come to the apartment, but that wasn't my style. Besides, I needed to have a serious talk with her if we were going to meet on a regular basis. Over dinner, we got to know each other much better. Besides being a very pretty girl, she turned out to be smart and a good conversationalist. She was starting her final year of university in September, and her studies were taking up a lot of her time. In the meantime, she had a summer job with a well-known firm of chartered accountants in Inverness. She had a steady boyfriend called Donnie, who was studying agriculture at UHI. He worked on a farm during the summer vacation, and they only met at weekends, so she could be my friend with benefits when I stayed in Inverness during the week. When she told me this, a wide grin played across her face. I felt a little sorry for Donnie, but she said they weren't exclusive. I was willing to bet he thought otherwise. Her mother didn't force Heather's hand, and I took her back to the apartment that Thursday night. I hadn't had anyone but Shauna for the better part of 8 years, and I'd forgotten the sheer pleasure of getting to know a new partner. She jumped at the chance to have a short, no-commitment relationship with a reliable older man, which is exactly how her mother had described me. That Friday, I took that Friday off from work to consult with an attorney so that I would be well prepared for what might happen as a result of the actions I planned to take. As summer gradually turned to fall, things got worse and better. My relationship with Shauna had changed. Although she was still giving herself to Callum McDarrell, I did not dislike her. I did all the same household chores as before, but I showed no particular affection for my wife when we were together and avoided socializing with her relatives or friends. Instead, I focused on socializing with young Robbie, even if it was just the three of us. For example, if we were walking somewhere, I was happy to hold hands with Robbie, but not with her. Nevertheless, we still had a good time together on weekends, taking Robbie on picnics in the hills or driving to the coast to buy fresh lobsters or crabs at the little fishing port. I'm sure Shauna understood why I was estranged from her, but perhaps she thought it was temporary. We seemed to have reached an unspoken agreement that we would not discuss anything related to her affair or the state of our marriage. That was fine with me because I knew what I was going to do and didn't want to make my intentions known too soon. Meanwhile, my personal life with Heather McDarrell was becoming more and more interesting. We met every Thursday when I had to stay late in Inverness. She would come to the apartment and cook dinner before staying the night. She made up a legend and told her neighbors that she was visiting her elderly aunt every Thursday. Next chapter. It was about mid-September when the shit hit the fan, or rather, vomit hit the pan. While making breakfast one Sunday morning, I heard the sound of someone throwing up in the bathroom. A short time later, a very pale Shauna appeared, clutching her robe with one hand and leaning against the kitchen doorway with the other. "Rob, could you do me a favor and make me some weak tea?" she asked. "No milk and no sugar. I'm going to go and lie down." "Sure, Shauna," I replied. "No problem. By the way, how far along are you?" Her shoulders slumped and she sighed. "I don't know," she said. "Let's talk later." She turned to leave and I put the kettle on. As far as I knew, Shauna had spent most of that Sunday in bed. The weather was gorgeous, so Robbie and I took my car and went on a little expedition to admire the beautiful fall leaves on the trees in the surrounding area. We stayed at a nice country inn for Sunday lunch and ended up coming home late in the afternoon. Robbie collected some fall leaves to show them to his mother, who was sitting in the living room dressed in sweatpants and a shapeless pullover. I cooked dinner while Robbie chatted with Shauna, who struggled to keep the conversation going while he enthusiastically explained to her how the leaves of deciduous trees change color after summer ends. I was very proud that he had memorized everything he had learned from me, even the fact that in some other countries they call autumn fall because the leaves fall off the trees. Later that night, after Robbie went to bed, Shauna and I had a mature conversation, although it was more of a conversation about how she sees her future. Earlier in the week, she threw up for the first time and went to the local doctor. They did an examination which confirmed that she was in the early stages of pregnancy, probably 6 to 8 weeks along. She hadn't told Callum that he was going to be a father because he had already decided to accept an offer to go to Edinburgh University and would be leaving the Glen the following week. "So now you expect me to just forget what this was all about?" I asked. "Asked me." "You knew it was only a temporary arrangement, Rob," she said. "Now that Callum has decided to leave the Glen for Edinburgh, it's over." "I don't understand how you could think we could just go back to the way things were," I replied. "On top of the weeks and months you spent having fun with Callum, you have a baby in your belly." "I beg you to forgive and forget about what happened," she pleaded. "You're a wonderful husband and father, Rob. A baby needs a loving family, and I hope you understand that." "Well, that's not exactly what I see," I replied. "I think Callum and you need to take responsibility for the consequences of your actions. Please don't expect me to share that burden with you." "But a new baby won't be a burden on us," she said. "It will be good for Robbie to have a little brother or sister, and another child won't add much to our expenses." "I don't think you understand," I told her. "I'm not interested in reconciling with you, and I'm not going to take parental responsibility for your bastard." She looked stunned, then burst into tears. "How can you be so cruel?" she exclaimed, running out of the room. A few days later, while I was on the road, Shauna filed for divorce. The divorce petition detailed when and where her infidelity with Callum McDarrell had occurred and stated that she was carrying his child. Even though she had been living in cloud cuckoo land for some time, I expected that Shauna would now realize that she would have to deal with the consequences of her actions. Shauna called me when she got the papers, but she was distraught and didn't understand anything. The gist of the conversation was how could I have been so cruel, to which I replied, "Weren't you cruel to me?" I didn't go back to Lochmagandy that weekend because there was no way I was going to live in the same house as Shona and give anyone reason to believe that the marriage hadn't irretrievably broken down. It wasn't an easy decision, but I expected that I would soon be able to visit Robbie for a few hours every weekend, even if I had to drive back and forth from Inverness each time to do so. The same day that Shauna received the summons, I called Heather McDarrell and informed her that Shauna and I were getting a divorce and I was ending our friendship. I enjoyed entertaining Heather, but I didn't want any complications from continuing a relationship with her, especially if her boyfriend Donnie was serious about his intentions. Over the next few months, many people tried to intervene, including Lady Fiona, who accused me of reneging on a deal she thought we had made. I pointed out that I had never said I would not divorce Shona. As far as I was concerned, Heather had made an unconditional offer simply because she liked me. It seemed unlikely to me that Lady Fiona would allow information about her daughter's affair with me to be used in a divorce case. I knew from a previous conversation with a lawyer that in Scotland, you can get a divorce if you separate and live apart from your spouse for 2 years, even if your spouse doesn't agree. I could have gone down that route but chose to plead adultery, and not just because I could name Callum McDarrell. I wasn't cruel for nothing. Sure, I got some satisfaction from calling him by name and shaming him, but I didn't want to end up with parental responsibility on the basis that I was married to Shona when the baby was born. Callum and Shona could take on that responsibility, and the child support agency would make sure Callum paid for his child's upbringing. I needed to divorce as soon as possible if I wanted to avoid this unpleasantness. Family law solicitors are just as stingy as other barristers, but I made a generous offer that allowed Shauna to keep the cottage in Lochmagandy and committed to a schedule of monthly child support payments until Robbie turned 18. Both solicitors tried to stall and get more money out of us, so a few more months passed, but eventually Shauna accepted that it was over between us. It seems she had reached a financial agreement with Callum and his family. Her pregnancy went smoothly, and she gave birth to a baby girl at the end of April, a couple weeks after the date of our official divorce. I rented a small apartment in Inverness on a permanent basis and drove to Lochmagandy every other Saturday to spend the day with Robbie. I wasn't interested in hearing about what was going on in Shauna's life, but Robbie was happy to have a baby sister, and Shauna and I tried our best to encourage him to be a caring and loving big brother. And I made it clear to Shauna that I was not going to participate in any general family activities when I came to visit Robbie. She tried to ambush me a couple of times, but eventually gave in, and from then on Robbie was ready for me when I arrived, so I didn't have to spend any more time with Shauna and her baby than necessary. I wasn't rude, but she soon realized that our conversation would never go beyond discussing the weather or how Robbie was doing in school. Life went on, and I began to adjust to a different pattern of social engagement. I had a lot more time to myself, including some amorous encounters, but I wasn't pursuing a long-term relationship. Oddly enough, this worked in my favor with quite a few women, but I tried to avoid the so-called bicycles that accompanied anyone who showed interest. Time passed, and a few years later I read in the local paper that Callum McDarrell was engaged to a girl he had met when they were both at Edinburgh University. She came from high society, her family were gentry, and lived in a huge old mansion on her country estate somewhere in Sussex or Surrey. The newspaper thought she was very attractive, and the article spoke of a Beauty and the Beast romance where a wild Scottish Highlander would be tamed by an aristocratic English beauty. I decided to visit her in Edinburgh before she made up her mind. It was not difficult to locate her, and she proved curious enough to understand the purpose of my visit and agree to meet me in a safe environment. We met in one of those lovely old Edinburgh pubs where there is a buzz of conversation, and it is hard to make out what others are saying unless you are sitting next to them. I recognized her from the picture in the paper, and soon we were sitting in a cozy little booth with a couple of glasses. "What's this all about, Mr. Johnson?" she asked, unaware that I was using a pseudonym. "Pardon the mystery, but I have some information about Callum McDarrell I'd like to let you know," I said. "There's no need to worry. It's not that scary, and you'll be able to check and verify what I'm about to tell you. Go on, she said. I'm listening, but I hope this isn't some kind of scam. Not at all, I replied. Let me ask you, how well do you get on with Callum's daughter? She looked puzzled. What are you talking about? Hasn't he told you about his daughter? I asked. No. Well, I suppose you will meet her in due course, I said. She lives in Lochmagondi with her mother. I find that very hard to believe. Are you sure he has a daughter? He's never mentioned having a daughter from a previous relationship. We have visited his parents several times in Lomagandi, and neither he nor they have ever mentioned that he has a daughter. Callum's daughter lives with her mother and older half-brother about half a mile from Callum's parents' house, I replied. Her name is Flora. She just turned 5 and will be going to school in the fall. From the looks of it, she's a sweet little girl, and I'm sure you'll get along with her, even if paying her expenses for the next 20 years will put a bit of a strain on your finances. She looked at me coldly. Do you have any proof that you're telling me the truth? I held out to her a copy of the divorce decree that stated Shona's adultery with Callum. You can easily have someone check for additional evidence, I said. It took her a moment to read the basic details, but she was clearly not satisfied. I can't believe he didn't tell me about this, she said. We were supposed to be married, and now you're telling me he has a daughter from a previous relationship with a single mom who lives practically on his doorstep. Look, I'm sorry if this is news to you, I said. This information is practically public knowledge, so I'm sure you could have found out without my interference. For all I know, he was probably going to tell you about it before the wedding. Whatever you do, please don't tell him how you found out, but it would be better if you found out sooner rather than later. After all, if you marry Callum, you will share his obligations and responsibilities. I will have to think about that, Mr. Johnson, she replied, but thank you for bringing it to my attention. May I keep this? She asked, holding up a copy of the divorce decree. Of course, I told her. It would be my pleasure. She got up to leave, and I felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she walked out of the busy pub. I would never see her again, and if things worked out as I envisioned, neither would Callum McDarrell see her again. About a month later, when I was picking up Robbie, I casually mentioned to Shona that I'd read in the paper that Callum McDarrell was getting married. Yes, he was going to, she said, looking at me suspiciously. But someone told his fiancée CE about Flora and she called it off. I hope it wasn't you, Rob. Me? I replied. Why would I do something like that? Later that year, I had another interesting conversation with a stranger in a pub. One of my colleagues had heard me talking about the stunning views from Mount Homagandi and insisted on introducing me to his uncle, who claimed to have hiked the hills in the area extensively in his youth. It turned out that this charming old man was a good friend of John McKee, the man Shauna called her father, and who had died in that terrible car accident before Shauna was born. He was stunned to learn that I was married to Shauna and asked why we were divorced. I told him the short version that she had an affair and got pregnant by another man. Gee, he said, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, Rob. What do you mean? Did you know that John McKee wasn't Shauna's biological father? I asked him. Yes, he nodded. And unfortunately, neither did John McKee, or he might still be alive. I thought he died in a car accident, I replied, wondering what he meant. That's what the insurance company decided, he said. The truth is a little different. After hearing your story, I think I can trust that you won't tell anyone what I'm about to tell you. John came to me because he had just found out that his wife was having an affair. I tried to comfort him, but he was completely devastated. I didn't tell anyone about what he told me, and his wife never found out because John drove his car over a cliff on the way home that day. I decided not to say anything, but I keep asking myself if I could have done more to help him, but I guess he just couldn't live with what she did. The old man paused for a moment, no doubt remembering his friend John McKee, and then looking me straight in the eye added, I'm so glad you're not like poor John. For a while, I put a lot of effort into my job and ended up heading up the Scottish Highlands Infrastructure Department for a multinational telecommunications company. Getting that job gave me great pleasure, although I wasn't the happiest person at the time. Things started to get better, but I think the healing process began when I met Ursula. She is a feisty German woman from Hamburg who divorced her husband for entertaining his personal assistant and decided she wanted to get away from it all and live in the Scottish Highlands. She loves hill walks, her outlook on life is very similar to my own, and she doesn't tolerate fools. To be honest, I think she can be a bit of a bear at times, but everyone else thinks she's a fox. We've been living together for 3 years now, but I don't know if we'll end up getting married. We're both hesitant to formalize our relationship, but who knows what could happen. Robbie turned 18 last month and will be coming to Inverness next year to go to university. In the meantime, he spends most of his free time partying with Heather McDarrell at Shona's house in Lochmagundy. Robbie had asked to give Heather to him, and she was hardly in a position to refuse his request. After all, she is a future chief and seems determined to continue the tradition of giving, whatever the consequences. I see Robbie at least once a week when he comes to visit us in Inverness. Over the past year, I've spent a lot of time telling him about giving. He now knows exactly why I divorced his mother, and why I want nothing to do with her or his half-sister Flora. It wasn't easy for him to come to terms with the behavior of his mother and her cronies, but he didn't fail to seize the opportunity to entertain Heather for nearly a year. Of course, Robbie didn't choose Heather by accident. It was on my recommendation that she got the job. Heather's husband, Donnie, yes, that Donnie, runs an animal feed supply company with a warehouse in the Inverness area. Donnie and Heather have a house in Lochmagundy, but he spends most of his time traveling around his customers and suppliers. They have been married for 10 years and have a beautiful 6-year-old daughter who spends a lot of time with her grandmother, Lady Fiona. I don't think Donnie knows about the gifts, and I'm not about to let him know that Robbie is entertaining his wife. Well, not now anyway. I'll wait until Robbie gets sick of her, and then we'll see what happens when Donnie finds out. Behind his warm and friendly facade is a hard-hearted businessman. It's unlikely that Donnie is one of those guys who acts like an asshole. I don't think he'll prosecute Robbie, but if I were making a bet, I'd bet on him burning some serious bitch. The end. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.